everybody. Welcome to the Maple Street Cemetery Tour. What a great crowd. Thank you for coming out. Let me tell you a little something about the cemetery before we start. A lot of research has been done on it recently, thanks to a grant from the Department of Environmental Management. And we know that the cemetery was made in 3 parts. The first and earliest part was at the Quaker Meeting House, where graves go back to maybe the 1780s. And then by the 1850s or late 1840s, the town of Adams bought this portion of the cemetery and called it Mount Vernon. In fact, the street that used to run through here was labeled on the 1853 map as Vernon Street and probably connected with what's now Cross Street and went over to Friend Street. In 1869, the town went and bought this piece of property between here and the Quaker Meeting House, and Charles Franklin Sales laid out the cemetery. He was an Adams boy. He lived over at where McBride's funeral home is today. And he was a trustee in the Library of Adams for maybe about 30, 40 years. He was a Norwich University graduate. He worked on the Hoosick Tunnel, and he kept a little store there at the corner of Center and Liberty Street. Some people might remember it before it was torn down in 1973 or 74. Your host this evening is actually Debbie Langner, and she'll be taking you around to the different places. We have 12 characters, and tour approximately takes a little over an hour, we decided. Enjoy the evening. Thank you for coming again. Yeah.
In another life, I fit in this uniform. My name is Jim Fassel. I was in the service, and I decided to be Lieutenant Colonel Sterling Burnett. We all hear about it. If you live in Adams, you all hear about Burnett, and you don't know who he is. And I was very interested to find out where he came from. His name was Curly. They were his friends. Played football with Zionites. Graduated in 1931 from Adams High School. Along with 103 other social activities, one of them happened to be the reserve, so he joined the reserve. He and Ray Tarsa took a correspondence course to be an officer. They were both sergeants. Ray had a wife and a child, so he flunked. Sterling became a lieutenant when World War II started. He went up through the ranks. If you're a line officer, if you survive, you go up through the ranks. He became a lieutenant colonel, and then he was killed. He was killed November 11th, 1944, fighting for a bridge in France. For the Third Army, he was fighting for Patton. He received the Distinguished Cross. That's the second highest medal. I'd like to read to you what it said, what he did, and it sounds like a person from Adams. In a citation accompanying the Distinguished Service Cross Award, it was stated that Colonel Burnett always placed himself in the vanguard of his aggressive infantry battalion, realizing the strategic importance of the last remaining bridge spanning the Need. He fearlessly braved the Nazi artillery, mortar, and small arm fire, attacking with the foremost elements of his point company, only to fall mortally wounded in bitterly defended approaches to the bridge. His soldiers, inspired by his gallant leadership and angry that he should die, they made sure that the enemy would not seize this vital area. So our Sterling Burnett now becomes a hero. But more interesting is when he came home. He came home in July of 1945. Okay, that's all after the European War was over. And if you can imagine Adams from the Congregational Church having a procession of military with all prestigious people from around going through the town and bringing Sterling Burnett to his final resting point right here. So Sterling Burnett was just not Curly. Sterling Burnett was just not an ordinary person from Adams. Sterling Burnett became a hero to the nation. He represents all those people that went to war and didn't come back. Joe Dyka, who's alive today, was the honor guard for his funeral. Ray Tarsa, his sister. Now Sterling had married his sister. So these names, I was fascinating to hear. The Watazics, the Tarsas, the Dykas, they're still around town. And so Sterling Burnett represents what was what was Adams and what was our commitment towards World War II. His gravesite was donated by the McGraths of Summer Street. And you can see what kind of feeling they had towards this very important war, good against evil. And so now we have a hero, and I hope you remember him. Thank you.
Howdy. My name's George Sale. One of the first boys to take off to fight that, put down the rebellion here. Back in 1861 it was when we took off. Hey, see my picture. My picture's hanging down in the library up there in Memorial Hall it is. Got it there for a reason I'd not like to have. See, it was back in 1861. I was a bookkeeper at one of the local mills. And we'd hear that the rebels had fired on Fort Sumter. Oh, well, them secession from the South was trying to break up the greatest government in the world. Well, we wasn't going to hear of it. We figured me and the boys could go down there, we can whip them rebs in 90 days. Figured we'd be home before the fall. And as fellers from the mills and from the farms, we was all bristling. We couldn't hardly wait to get there. We was afraid that the fighting be over before we'd see the action. So we went to Springfield and learned how to be good soldiers. Weren't exactly as exciting as we had figured. It was drill, 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 stop for a roll call, and then some more drill. But finally, we was down in Washington City. Oh, what a disgusting place it is. I'm glad it was brought back here to the Berkshires to be buried, not in Washington City. Oh, it's in a den of iniquity it is there. But we was there with some boys from Rhode Island and a lot of boys from up here in New England. And we was put under a feller by the name of Burnside, General Burnside. He had these big whiskers on his cheeks here. And we was going to go down to North Carolina, we was. So we was all excited. We got on a boat, if you want to call it that. It was a boat called the Pickett. Headed off from Annapolis in Maryland, went down to Fort Monroe. And from there we departed and we ended up in a place called Cape Hatteras in North Carolina. We got... we was there in early February, well, weren't much time. Well, we was over on the mainland. Now, North Carolina, it ain't what I had heard. I mean, it was nothing but mosquitoes and snakes. And, it rained almost every day there in February we was there. But we marched on up to a place called Roanoke, and we had our first little skirmish there. I'd seen the elephant. Seen my first action I had. And it weren't as exciting as I figured. There was boys said they was going to be so brave and win medals, and they might have had brave hearts, but they had cowardly legs because a lot of them fellas was heading back to the boat. It were about 2 weeks later. We was up heading into a place called New Bern. We got ourselves into quite a scrabble there in Burnside's expedition. See, we'd come up and pushed the rebs. We figured we'd had them lipped. And we came in and took some of their guns, their big cannons was. And we was holding them, kept looking back, waiting for reinforcements. Because I'd seen there was a lot of them stars and bars over there reforming. It was coming back to push us out, they was. Well, those reinforcements never came. I took a bullet in the head, and that sort of ended my passion for glory. I was buried there in North Carolina for a few weeks it was. Actually, it's near into spring. And then some of my friends and family got my body dug up, and I'm right over down that hill, up in that top there, got quite a view. But that was my story, and I was about 20 years old and figured I'd like to do some other things, but, you know, glad to hear that rebellion was put down.
When you travel through the paths in this cemetery, you see many beautiful views, and there are many fine monuments to the important men from our town. But you may think that this part is very sad, because where they buried the young of the poor. There where the hill is steep and the ground is rocky, that is where they buried the babies of the immigrants. Maybe they thought that if you were poor and you didn't speak English so good, it didn't hurt so much when you lost one more child. But when they buried my Miechu there, it was like they buried a piece of my heart. In 1890, when I left my dear Poland to come here and follow my brothers to America, we knew that this was the one place in the world where we could change our station in life. And there was plenty of work for us in the mills, but there was no place where we could hear Mass in our own native tongue. And it gave me comfort to know that this was the one part of the cemetery that was closest to a Catholic church. We could go to the Irish church on Park Street, St. Charles Church, and the kind father there, Father Moran, arranged for twice a year to have a priest, Father Hadauka, to come from Chicopee, and he would hear our confessions on Easter and Christmas. But as more and more Polish people came to Adams, we decided that it was important for us to have our own church, and we petitioned the bishop, and he sent Father Kopichevich to us. And Notre Dame Church was kind enough in 1902 to allow us to have Mass said there. But in 1903, we began our own building project. $3 I made every week in the mills, $3. $1 I sent back to Poland to pay for my ticket. $1 I saved for room and board. And $1 went to the church. $1! That's how important it was for us to have our own church. In 1906, when I buried my Miechu here, there were spires from 3 Catholic churches rising to the heavens. In 1912, a school opened for the Polish people and 400 Polish-speaking children were enrolled. In 1916, ground was consecrated on Orchard Street, and a Catholic Polish cemetery was opened there. And that's where my dear husband and I are buried, and 6 of our 8 children. But a part of me will always be here with my dear Miechu. Thank you.
Inaugurated 4th president in 1809, a few weeks after my husband was born. I believe his parents admired James Madison and named their son after the president. My husband was a fine carpenter. In fact, he built the house we lived in. The house is still there at 22 Maple Street. It is a yellow and green Victorian that stands on the corner of Forest Park and Maple. In my day, Forest Park was called Prospect Street. The land on which our house was built was purchased from Horatio Dean in 1872. I was born December 20th, 1806 in Cheshire. I was 26 when I married James in Savoy on April 24th, 1832. Our son George was born January 25th, 1833. Our son married Sarah Nichols and moved to New Jersey. They had a daughter, Grace, who sadly died at age 25. George received us also in 1889, 2 years before my husband. My husband was ill for a week and died on May 24th, 1891. I died a couple months after my 89th birthday, on February 27th, 1896, at my home. I had been confined to my bed for about 3 months. My funeral was held from my home on Maple Street, and Reverend Foskey officiated. I imagine I was brought here with a horse-drawn hearse. My husband had one brother, Calvin, who outlived us all. He died at 90 years of age in September 1896, 6.5 months after my death. None of us lived to see the 20th century.
I am Levi Lawrence Brown. Most people know me as L.L. Brown. I was born in Adams in 1826, and I was laid to rest over here 100 years ago in August 25th. In my row with me is my two sisters, my mother, Keziah Jenks. She came from a pioneer Quaker family, and they came to own land from as far as Stafford Hill down to the center of Adams. Next to her is Rufus Brown, my father, whose sister married General Plunkett. When she died, his niece married him. And I stand there, and I'm here buried between my two wives. Both of them were Howland sisters. They own most of the north part of town, Howland Avenue. If you haven't figured it out yet, most of the rich people in Adams were either married to each other or part of the family. When I was 20 years old, I went down to Dalton to learn the papermaking trade from Zanus Crane. I knew I wasn't going to work for anybody else, and I came back up here, and my two uncles, Samuel and Daniel Jenks, the Tall Monument, put up the money and gave me the business know-how, and we started a paper mill. The first one was on Commercial Street, where McDonald's and the town common is today. The second one was farther up the street, where the mill houses are, and the third one was in West Cummington. When I was 41 years old, I entered into partnership with two men from Scotland, Jimmy Renfrew and James Chalmers. Together, we built Renfrew Manufacturing Company to the north of town here. We built those brick row houses and a big factory. We prospered, and there were 6 plants in Adams, and we were the largest employer in Adams for over 20 years. When I was 55, I went into partnership with my son-in-law, Emil Kipper. He was a chemist from Germany, and he had a patent for a thing that you people today would probably call plastics. It was a successful business, and we started a small neighborhood up farther north in town called Xylan. Unfortunately, it only lasted about 9 years, and I had to sell out to DuPont. We only did it to get rid of the competition. By the 1880s, I was one of the wealthiest men in the county. I had not only interests in Adams, but I also owned part of the Freeman Works in North Adams, and the Whiting Paper Company in Holyoke. I had a huge house on the corner on Commercial Street, and I had a greenhouse where we grew exotic plants even during the winter time. I had a fine stable of horses, and I used to parade them around the streets of Adams to show them all off to the people. But later in life, I fell on some hard times and had some financial setbacks. U.S. Marshals arrested me for defaulting on a loan to a Boston bank. I died with more liabilities than assets. My poor wife lived in our huge mansion in a couple of rooms, almost destitute. Unfortunately, my cousin, C.T. Plunkett, tore my mansion down, gave the property to the town of Adams, and built a school there and put his name on it. I wish I could have done that. Then generations of school children today would be going to the L.L. Brown Elementary School. Go on now. Listen to some other dead people.
My name is Mrs. Isaac Collins. My husband Isaac left his mark on the town of South Adams in a way that will not be forgotten. It was through his efforts that the mother town was able to break away and become an independent township. His deed is immortalized here on his gravestone with this inscription: by his means and labors, succeeded in securing an independent township to Adams in 1878 by setting off North Adams from Adams. He traveled to Boston and argued before the general court for this to be done. Perhaps what is more amazing is that he was not a lawyer or politician by trade. He came to Adams as a tailor and was able to become prosperous as a real estate developer. Many of you may remember the beautiful Collins block that at one time stood on Center Street and took up the entire block between Myrtle and Dean Streets. That same location today is the parking lot of the Big Y supermarkets. Thank you.
The exploits and adventures of a gang of young boys who roamed and explored the hills surrounding Adams were recorded in a series of books for children written by Adams native Charles Pierce Burton. The books, written in the early part of the last century, depict life in Adams during the time period following the Civil War. The characters in these books represent the author's childhood friends. A favorite character of many readers is little Benny Wade, the youngest of the gang. Benny represents Burton's friend, Dr. Harry Holmes, buried here. Dr. Holmes' home stands on Liberty Street, now part of the McBride Funeral Home. At the time that he lived there, the view from the front porch was of a mill pond and, of course, Bob's Hill.
Maybe someday you'll read the book too.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I am a worker from the Renfrew Cotton Mill. The first mill employees came to the area in the early 1800s. They were daughters of local farmers from the surrounding farms and hill towns. The railroad's arrival brought with it a wave of industrial expansion and a demand for workers. The call of workers was answered by many immigrant groups. By 1850, the census listed more factory workers than farmers. I worked and I lived in the gingham grounds of Adams, also known as Renfrew. The name Renfrew was adopted because many employees had come from that section in Scotland. The name Gingham Grounds came from the main product of the Renfrew Manufacturing Company. It was gingham cloth. The company became famous for its red and white checkered tablecloths. During the height of its prosperity, the Renfrew Manufacturing Company had employed more than 2,500 operatives, making it for many years the area's largest employer. The hours were long, my work was very tedious, and at times very difficult. But we were our own community. We had a company store, we had housing, and company-sponsored athletic teams. Although the mill that housed the Renfrew Manufacturing Company is now gone, the row houses that were built to house the employees along the main road serve as a reminder of the past. My employer's monument is right over to my left here. Thank you.
What did you do, Julia? Did you go down to the old age housing and bring them all up here, or what?
We double our every year our audience.
Well, I'm Henry J. Bliss, former town council in Adams. Was town council for 8 or 9 years, appointed in 1846. I was born in Dalton in 1917, and I studied under the clerkship of a lawyer, Courtemanche, in Pittsfield. And I came to Adams in 1843, and I was appointed in 1846. And the reason I'm here this morning, this afternoon, or whatever it is, it's difficult when you've been around for 120 years to be with my wife here, Anna Fisk. Remember Fisk Road?
Oh yeah, Fisk Road.
Well, she was one of the Fisks up there on Fisk Road. They used to grow cabbages, corn, and they call them in those days, I think it was poppies. They used to grow poppies up there for a cash crop. But in any event, it was my function to represent the town, and I did this in the history books actually when they brought Columbus, the 12-ton elephant. He was the only elephant in the Western Hemisphere at that time in 1851. And he came from an exhibition in North Adams, and he got down here to the bridge near the South Adams Savings Bank, and it was a wooden bridge in those days, and his tender and owner was a gentleman named Elias Anderson. And he prodded the elephant forward, although the elephant was reluctant to go because he could sense that it was not safe. The elephant fell in 20 feet into the brook bed. And it took, I think it was 43 men and three teams of horses to get him out. But the elephant, Columbus, had suffered huge internal injuries, and they walked him all the way to Lenox, where they put him in a barn, called a veterinarian, and his cries could be heard for 3 days. He kept the entire village awake for 3 days until poor Columbus finally died. He was supposed to go to Stockbridge for an expedition, he never made it. Mr. Anderson later sued the town for $20,000 in the Common Pleas Court in Boston, and I, as town council, had to defend the town. $20,000 in those days was quite expensive because our town budget was $8,000. We didn't have school superintendents and Chapter 766 then to take care of. We were just a regular red schoolhouse down here. And of course, when our kids got out of school, they could read and write. You can't do that today, they tell me. I don't know. But in any event, we settled out of court and for $1,200, finally, about 1861, I think it was. And that's the story of Columbus. Before you go over here and see Mr. Plunkett, we'll try to tell you what a great family it was, what great things they did for the town of Adams, and actually what they did was they sent agents to little villages in Poland and brought over their poor and used them as cheap labor here. And if you think they did good things for the Polish people in Adams, these Plunkett people right over here, just ask those old ladies what it'd be, barber tenders and what have you, working what? I think it was 16 hours a day, 6.5 days a week. Because they were Catholic, the Plunkett's very generously gave them 2 hours off to go to church.
Big heart.
But before you go, there's myths, you know, in this history stuff. And Mr. Schlock over here advised me to give you this message. You know, you've heard about the Continental Constitution of the United States back in 1778 when they put the whole thing together. They sent 55 men to the convention, and they'd like you to believe that they were honest, sober, hard-working individuals. They came from the 13 colonies. Those 55 men, 19 didn't show up. For no good reason except one, Henry Blount. He came out of New York State, and he couldn't get down, he wouldn't come down here on horseback because he had hemorrhoids. the other 18 just didn't show up. So those 55 chosen to attend the convention, only 39 signed the document. 12 people left early, and 4 others refused to sign. A lot of them ran out of money and had to leave because they were doing such a hatchet job in price gouging there, observes Terry Brent, who was a constitutional researcher for the association. Besides, he adds, the hot weather and high humidity must have been murder on the delegates, who wore wool breeches and coats in those days. They must have felt like dying, he said. Independence Hall must have smelled like a cattle barn. And how did the founding fathers, those great Americans who wrote this great document, which we treat like a holy grail today in our country, how did they unwind during this pivotal moment in our nation's history? By getting drunk as skunks. One document that survived is the booze bill for the celebration party, thrown 2 days before the Constitution was signed on September 17, 1787. According to the bill, 55 people at the party drank 54 bottles of Madeira, 60 bottles of claret, 8 bottles of whiskey, 22 bottles of port, 8 bottles of cider, 12 bottles of beer, and 7 large bowls of alcoholic punch. And these were really huge punch bowls because ducks could swim in them. The partiers were also serenaded by 16 musicians, and they had to be royally drunk. They signed the Constitution on the 17th, and on the 16th they were lying on the streets of Philadelphia sobering up. In any event, enjoy your soiree with Mr. Plunkett down there.
Perhaps no family has left a greater mark on the town of Adams than my own. A school is named after my son Charles, and a former hospital after my son William. Allow me to introduce myself. I am General William C. Plunkett, buried right over there, and temporarily let out of Hades to speak to you folks this evening. I was born in Lenox in 1800, and I was hardworking but rather poor, so I had to alternately teach and attend school, a somewhat unusual situation, I'm sure you'll agree. I was so thrifty that people used to say of me that until I turned 18, I hadn't spent 12.5 cents on myself. I moved to Adams in 1830 with $270 as the manager of a cotton mill. And within a few short years, I managed to save enough money to buy the company. I married well twice. My first wife, Asha Brown, was a descendant of one of Adams' founding families. When she died at the early age of 36, I married her niece, Lavisa. Lavisa and I had 2 sons and 2 daughters. Our daughters, Mary and Carrie, both died when they were still teenagers, but our sons, Charles and William, survived us. Our home, Montroth, was a beautiful mansion located approximately where the current town hall is on Park Street, and it was named after my mother's estate in Ireland. And I'll get back to Montroth in a little bit, but let me continue with my story. My sons and I founded the Berkshire Mills on Hoosick Street, which at one time was the largest cotton mill in the entire country. And in 1897, our family fortunes reached their high point. I was already dead by that time, but my son William, who was then living in Montroth, the family estate, hosted President William McKinley, who we all dearly loved because his pro-tariff policies helped this nation's economy and helped make us richer, unlike, unfortunately, Presidents Roosevelt and Wilson, whose tax and spend liberal policies didn't do our family much good. Anyhow, my wife Lavisa died in 1881, and I passed away 3 years later in 1884. And as I said, our family reached its high point around 1897. Unfortunately, about 20 years after that, both my son William and his son William, you see sort of a George Foreman angle here, passed away within months of one another, and our family estate was hit with a double whammy of tax liabilities, and that, combined with changes in the country's textile industry, did in both the family fortune and, in slow motion, the Adams textile mills as well. And that's it. Now I have to go back in there.
I'm David Richmond. I started out in life as a farmer, but I became a major real estate developer in Adams. I laid out streets and I sold building lots mostly on the east side of town. I made housing for the new employees of the Berkshire Cotton Manufacturing Company in the 1890s. You should all be familiar with my name, Richmond. I placed it on 3 streets in town: Richmond Street, Richmond Lane, and Richmond Avenue. In 1960, the residents of Richmond Avenue petitioned to have the name changed to Morningside Avenue because they were frustrated with having their mail misdelivered. I also named 3 of my streets after my 3 sons, Albert, Clifford, and George. But you know, I had trouble with the names of my streets sticking. The residents of George Street petitioned to have the name changed to Victory Street during World War II. Because of the 20 houses on Victory Street, there were 27 families that had members of their household that were serving in the armed forces. It amounted to 50 soldiers. The Richmonds were a very large and influential family in Adams for many generations. They consisted of farmers, merchants, teachers, and druggists. My 2 sons, Clifford and Albert, were electricians in town. They had a shop on Summer Street at the location where Burnett's shoe store was. my son George was a contractor in town. At this time, there are no Richmonds left living in Adams. The last one to be buried here was in 1996. I passed away in 1905, and my wife Lucy passed away in 1933. Behind me are 54 graves bearing the Richmond name, and there's still 4 streets in town still being used from my immediate family. In closing, I would like to pass on to you, if anybody is out there is house shopping, my homestead is for sale at this time on Center Street. It was built by my father in 1844. My parents were original pioneer settlers in Adams. The house was passed on to my brother, who lived there for many years. It was sold to the Barrett family in town, who divided the lot in half, and the barn at the rear of the lot was sold to the Trottier family, who later renovated it into the Trottier Funeral Home. The yard and the spacious garden was turned into the parking lot for the mortuary. But the house, for being 157 years old, still looks pretty good. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your tour.
Thou might be surprised to hear this, and it does not show proper Quaker humility to say so. But as an acclaimed preacher in the Society of Friends, I was the most well-known woman born in Adams until my niece, Susan B. Anthony, gained much greater fame later in the 19th century. I was born on the 6th month, 8th day, 1797, at the old Joshua Lapham homestead at the corner of East Hoosick Street and East Road, the 3rd child of Humphrey Anthony and Hannah Lapham Anthony. My parents were from Quaker pioneer families that settled here in 1770 from Smithfield, Rhode Island and Dartmouth, Massachusetts. In keeping with the Quaker principle that women should share the same educational advantages as men, I attended the school that my father built on his property, and in 1812, I went with my older brother Daniel, that's Susan's father, and my elder sister Susanna to attend for 2 years the 9 Partners School in Dutchess County, New York. Quakers from as far away as Boston sent their children there to be educated. At a time when society in general did not allow women to speak in public, Quaker women spoke in meeting, had a voice in secular matters, shared these high seats as elders, and were preachers, addressing the meeting as their inner spirit moved them. I was invited to preach at Quaker meetings in several states. In 1839, I gave a long religious homily, a high discourse, at the Quaker annual meeting in Brooklyn, New York. My niece Susan, who was able to attend because she had recently accepted a teaching position in New Rochelle, pronounced it very good. I must admit, however, that judging from remarks she made in a letter she wrote home afterwards, that she was much more impressed by another Quaker preacher, Rachel Barker, who spoke on the evils of prostitution and houses of ill fame. In 1835, my husband Isaac and I moved with our children to Hoosick Falls, New York. We lost all our property here after a business partnership with my husband failed. A decade later, after I was widowed, I returned home to Adams to care for my aging father. I died on the 7th month, 15th day, 1869, in the room where I was born.